Um, Hello, everyone. We are back. We've been here talking about being nerds together for a while, but now is the official beginning of the second virtual Wells College Visiting Writers Series event for the fall 2020 semester. Right off the bat, I want to say that this reading, like all of our events, is made possible by the generous support of the New York State Council for the Arts. Thank you, Niska. We are, as always, very grateful. I'm Dan Rosenberg. I'm the director of the Visiting Writer Series. And tonight's reader, Bob Proehl, is no stranger to Wells and Wellsians. He's visited Wells a couple of times over the years to share his work. And this semester, he's on faculty, teaching a very popular course on genre fiction. He's also been invaluable in the development of some of our upcoming events for this very series. So thank you, Bob, for all that you've done and continue to do for our little community. And everyone, welcome. Here's the plan for tonight. After my brief intro, Bob will read from his new book, The Somebody People. You'll all be muted as you are now, but there is a chat option that some of you have already, or Celeste has already taken advantage of, which is great. You should feel free to type questions into the chat and I will jump in with Bob in between sections at like a natural breaking point to pose your questions to him. So if you want to respond to specific pieces or something comes to mind that you think others might want to hear from Bob about, please go ahead and send them in. I was really happy with how that process worked at our last event with Kiki Petrosino, with the range of voices asking questions and how it made the whole evening feel more interactive and less like a presentation that we could have just recorded and posted for you or something, right? There'll also be time for a more formal Q&A at the end of the reading. And during that Q&A, you can again type your questions into the chat and I will be your voice. Or you can use the raise hand feature on Zoom and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question yourself. I was going to ask if that sounds good, but you can't tell me. So I'm going to assume that it does. I appreciate some thumbs up on the top. Lovely. You can tell who's very comfortable in Zoom and who's just like, where am I in this box or not? So now it's my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce Bob Proehl here. And Bob is the author of The Somebody People and its precursor, The Nobody People, as well as 100,000 Worlds, which was a Booklist Best Book of the Year. He's had many jobs, including as a bookseller and programming director for Buffalo Street Books in Ithaca. And I want to just go ahead and plug that right now. It's a fantastic independent bookstore and a cornerstone of the literary community here in Ithaca and in the larger area. So I'll say it here and I'll say it again at the bottom. If you would like to buy Bob's book, I just put a link in the chat to how you could do that straight from Buffalo Street. So please support, if you can, your local and independent bookstores, or screw it, support our local bookstore, even if it's not local to you. Bob has also been a DJ and a record store owner and a bartender. He was a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow in Fiction and a resident at the Saltonstall Arts Colony. His work has appeared on Salon and as part of the 33 1/3 book series and in American short fiction. The two books of this duology, of which The Somebody People is the second, have been compared frequently to the X-Men stories. And I probably did something similar in the ad you read about this event tonight. And you can see why. There's something very straightforward about it. There's a population of people who have superpowers and there is a population that doesn't. And how do they get along? It's not very good. If that sounds reasonably familiar, things take a hard turn pretty quickly. And I'm just trying to admit someone who won't be admitted. There we go. Okay. This book, the second book, picks up after The Pulse suddenly gave millions more people superpowers. And after the Civil War that followed, which the people with powers unsurprisingly won. But what this book really explores, what sets it apart, is the cost of that victory, the very human cost. That basic sort of narrative that I just outlined has been used as an allegory for all sorts of oppression, right? Mutants as gay people, mutants as the disabled, mutants as whatever marginalized population. But those allegories can rarely account for the incredible power imbalance between those with special abilities and those without. What would happen if a marginalized community of humans, fallible, vulnerable, sometimes not terribly bright humans, suddenly had the power to absolutely dominate the former majority? Part of what this book is interested in is the damage of force, the damage it does to its victims and its perpetrators. And in that, it feels entirely new. And I feel like I'm not being specific enough. And part of that is because it's also very complicated. Um, it's driven by a sizable cast of compelling characters. What unites them is that they're all broken in some way by their past, by their experiences. And many are trying to just make it through in a way that resonates with me, and I bet with you, in our current historical moment, maybe a bit more than we might like. And then for all of that complexity, it's also just a beautifully told, entertaining, exciting story. And now Bob is going to share some of it with us. So I'll just remind you one more time to put questions or comments in the chat, and I will butt in and read them to Bob while there are natural breaks. But now I'm going to turn off my video and turn it over to Bob.
All right. Yeah, so I am going to cheat slightly. I was trying to decide the best way to approach reading from a sequel to a book that many of you may not have read. So yeah, this is the second of two books. So I'm actually going to read a little bit from the first one, and then I'm going to read from a new thing that is finished and is still sort of looking for a publisher. But and then we'll take a break in the middle for questions. So I'm going to read a bit from the Nobody People. This is my beat up reading copy. And this is from a chapter called Fade Away and Radiate. And this takes place at the school for people who have superpowers. They refer to themselves as resonants. And this is Carrie Norris, who's one of the central characters in both of the books. The first thing anyone asks when you start here is, what was your first time like, Carrie says. First week, you answer that 100 times. The best thing is to get an audience, tell everyone in one shot. Savvy noobs hold out their whole first day and spill in the student lounge post-dinner, or they wait until after lights out, when anyone who's not messing around or getting high meets up in the hive to shoot the shit. If you're real lucky, you have a first-time story so bizarre, it spreads on its own. My friend Letitia, her first time was during her first time. Her other first time. She levitated the bed they were on until her boyfriend's ass was bumping the ceiling fan of her room. He screamed, then she screamed, then the bed came crashing down. Her mother was downstairs saying her rosary and busted in on them. Everyone knows that story. I think it'll stay here after we're gone. Like third graders telling the same jokes when you were telling the same jokes you told when you were in third grade. My first time is less racy, but it's different enough. They used it as an example in ability theory class, like a thought experiment. Can you have your ability fully manifested and not know? Your first time is an event. A bird talks to you, your hand bursts into blue flames, you sprout a second face on the side of your regular face and it starts singing show tunes. So after it happens, you react, you freak out, or the people around you freak out. Maybe you get beaten, maybe you go nuts, and then someone in the hive spots you and tells you what's happening. You're saved. I didn't notice, not all at once. I was 13, I lived in Deerfield, Illinois, near Chicago. I started to notice people paying less attention to me. I stopped getting called on in class or picked for teams in gym. I wasn't super popular or anything, just sort of in the middle. These things happen, and I didn't think much about it. Then my so-called boyfriend ghosted me in the hall between classes. I texted him right from the next class. He said, didn't see you, but that was bullshit because he looked right at me. I thought I guess through. Anyway, I didn't want to come off like a stalker. I texted Kay, and I didn't think about it for a while. It got worse. My parents started leaving me out of conversations at dinner. My brother stopped pestering me all the time. It was nice at first. Everything was quieter. And then there were the dreams. Every night I dreamed I was at a huge party. It was packed with people, but none of them could see or hear me. The dreams wouldn't come just when I was asleep. I drifted to the party in class or listening to music in my room. The isolation made things worse. Even in my dreams, I was invisible. The worst parts get lost when you're telling a story. The lesson of a story is that you lived to tell it. If that's the end, how do you communicate the point where you were pretty sure you wouldn't or didn't even want to? The time in the middle when surviving was unlikely or even hateful. For weeks, I knew what was happening, but I didn't have a name to put to it. I was fading out of the world and couldn't find a way to stop it. And I gave up. I became convinced I would disappear entirely and that this was the best outcome. The alternative was to stay as I was, a ghost haunting my own life. Fahima and Sarah found me in a diner. I used to go there because there was one waitress who could see me. I figured out when she was working, not because I was going to starve otherwise. It felt good having her see me. She wasn't there that day, so I was just sitting. Fahima and Sarah stood out right away. There aren't many women in Deerfield who wear hijab. And Sarah had Cortex with her, which is a total health code violation. Cortex is a dog. But they walked right in and sat down in the booth across from me. I remember Cortex snuck under the table and lay down on my feet. Sarah said they'd been looking all over for me. We knew you existed, she said. We kept looking in the wrong place. Then Fahima said they had to look at all the places I wasn't. And when they ruled those out, they knew I'd be here in this booth at the diner. Being found was a miracle. The fairy tale quality of it, the dreamy strangeness of that day in the diner is precious to me. I never think to interrogate it, to make sense out of it. It's enough that it happened. They told me what I was, that there were others like me, that they were like me. They told me about the Bishop Academy. Fahima said there was a place for me there if I wanted it. You grow up reading fantasy novels where some poor girl in a drudging life finds out she's a princess. The whole world makes you ready for a moment like this to happen. Even before I started to disappear, my life felt ill-fitting, maybe designed for someone else. I was attached to it because it was mine. Watching my own life from inside it, I saw its limits. My boyfriend was cute, but he didn't give a shit about music or books or anything. My parents were nice, but they'd just ended up with kids like you do. If they wanted them, they hadn't wanted one like me. Fahima and Sarah offered me a way out. I never wanted anything more. They came to my house the next day. They were wearing business suits. They looked like salespeople, except for Fahima's hijab. My mom let them in and told my dad to go make coffee. Fahima gave her a brochure. Some kids' parents get the Academy for the Arts pitch, but I've never been all that arty. My mother even asked what my talent was, and Fahima said she falls more on the gifted side. It hurts to remember my mother asking a stranger what's so special about my daughter. Aren't parents supposed to know? Shouldn't she have had a list? Just as bad was the look of surprise on my parents' faces when my name was brought up, as if they'd forgotten me completely, and were mildly inconvenienced to be reminded. My mom asked how much it cost. Nothing about college placement or extracurricular activities. I don't even know if she asked where it was. I spent the rest of the week wrapping up things at my old school. There wasn't much to do. I slipped off the radar of my friends. My teachers had to be reminded they had me in class. Boyfriend was dating someone else. My last day at Deerfield Middle, I walked through the halls, trailing my fingers along the lockers, like I was trying to make good memories to come back to later. But it was just a place I went to school because my parents got jobs in Deerfield and bought a house in that school district. It wasn't special, so I stopped. At the end of my last day, I sat in the stall in the girls' bathroom and wrote Carrie was here and the date on the door in red Sharpie. It was a stupid thing to do. I watched the ink thinking it would fade. When it stayed, I started to cry. My parents drove me to Chicago for the flight to New York. I had one suitcase. They were supposed to mail my books, but they never did. While they were waiting at the gate, my dad kept forgetting why we were there. My flight got called, and I hugged my parents and my brother. They seemed relieved, like it was hard work to notice me, and they were glad they didn't have to do it anymore. They could just let me go. The Bishop Academy was Deerfield Middle all over again. Fahima promised we'd start training together, but she forgot. I got thrown into classes. People looked past me in the hallways. Teachers didn't notice I was there. Then Miguel, he's my friend. He's an empath. He got a feeling when he walked by me in the hall. He stopped and looked right at me. He was the first person who did. And he said, "I'm sorry. You've been here the whole time, haven't you?" It was special. It meant a lot. I threw my arms around him and cried into his shoulder, and he hugged me back without hesitation. I've never been able to separate my feelings for Miguel from the relief I felt in that moment. Sometimes I hear it thrumming underneath our conversations, a bass line. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you. That's it.
That's great. Actually, I'll be a disembodied voice here, just asking a question that I wanted to, yes, I'm right behind you, Bob. A question that maybe doesn't derive exactly from that, but it kind of does, which is that you write from a wide range of points of view in here, and there's some license to it being like a sci-fi world, right? You're not sort of representing these people as like actual lived experience in sort of realist fiction or whatever, but it's still, you're writing from a really broad diversity of voices. You've got narrators of color, narrators who are women, narrators whose experiences are quite unlike what your own might be. And I was just wondering if you could tell us for a minute about like what went into building those characters so that they felt real and multidimensional and lived in an experience that's so far from your own.
Yeah, it's it sort of starts with voice and what characters seem to be sort of speaking the most clearly. I work in multiple points of view, and I work generally in third person close. And so yeah, the first book is driven by a sort of a dad character and a teenage girl, and then an adult teacher at the school, who's female and Muslim and queer. And a lot of it is just sort of working through empathy and working with respect for those voices. And it does have to do with limiting the types of stories that you tell. Like there are parts of these characters' narratives that they're just not really my stories to tell for various reasons. But I did want, I wanted the book to, I think one of the problems when you have sort of science fiction discrimination, when you have like the mutant metaphor, or like you have this sort of stand-in for racism or for ability to discrimination or anything else, is that it becomes sort of monolithic, and you lose a sense of intersectionality. And particularly with Fahima, who is, like I said, she's one of the teachers at the school. I really wanted, first of all, she wasn't going to be one of the characters who I wrote with her point of view, but she was the most fun to write, and just became a really compelling voice in my head. But I wanted for her someone who had a very different experience of what discrimination looked like and what it felt like, and what the risks of particularly like government involvement in that were. So it's not just that she is discriminated against because she has these superpowers, but she's coming to this like, I have family that were like picked up by Homeland Security, so we have to approach these things in a different way. We have to be more pragmatic, and that sort of like defines her character, and is one of the defining parts of her character, and how she deals with this like weird science fictional situation comes out of her lived experience. I will say that for that character, we did end up having a sensitivity reader go through the book and give me notes on things that I wasn't quite getting right, and things that should maybe be pulled back or put off limits. And that was like hugely helpful. And in addition to that, I have friends who are Muslim, and I would just check things on a pretty regular basis.
That's fantastic. And do you want to go forward? There's another question in the chat, or you could keep us going. I'll read it to you.
Okay, I didn't know that.
It is from Leah Elliott, and the question is, was there a character that was particularly difficult to write in or about, one whose voice was harder to pull out?
I often find that the characters that like are demographically closer to me are the most difficult. So the dad character, Avi Hirsch in the first one, and then Clay in the second book, the dad characters were a little difficult at first. And it was really just a matter of like not channeling myself so much through them, and like creating them as more wholly separate. So yeah, both books, for reasons, there are two different dad characters, one in each of the books, and so yeah, finding those voices so that they weren't just like me talking about my own kids was a little difficult. But once I got that, and once I found those differences, it was easier to work with, and particularly in the second book, because Clay is meant to sort of be a response to Avi in the first book. So it was easier to get a sense of where I wanted Clay to be at as a parent.
Very cool. Thanks.
But yeah, I mean, like Carrie, you know, just Carrie is a girl, but she's also like a super nerdy, like way into music teenager. So like I had things to draw on there.
That's funny. We have a follow-up from Naomi Stockwell, who asks, I am writing a book with a character that's similar to me too, and she's my least favorite character because her flaws remind me of my own. How did you overcome that with the dad characters?
Like I leaned way into it. Yeah, with both. You know, with Avi in the first book, he's a character who's like paranoia around parenting becomes sort of destructive, and so like taking my own fears and just like amplifying them to a point that is like actually unhealthy, rather than just like maybe unhealthy. Arguably, like something that would actually cause one's kid to have to go into therapy as opposed to like probably. And then with Clay in the second book is a lot more comfortable. He's an adoptive parent, and his kid is a little older, and he has kind of grown into the role differently. So with Clay, a lot of times it was just about being a dorky dad. Like he makes dad jokes, makes his kid uncomfortable in social situations in the way that like a caring parent often does. But it was also, Clay is a veteran of this conflict that's going on, and that's something that he is like he thinks he is keeping his child safe from. And so it's just something that he doesn't talk about. And like, you know, there's a weird, like writing for a living is a weird job, and you're doing weird emotional work like during the day, and then you sort of go back to your family, having gone through like a whole thing. And there is that sort of like protective thing, like, you know, what are the ways that you talk about work, and what are the ways that you shut that down and you leave work sort of compartmentalized. So again, like obviously amplified because he's been like in active combat, but it was sort of drawing on that, which is something that I don't worry about that much for myself. So like pushing that worry, I think a lot of times with characters, you're just like, you're dealing out your own anxieties, like cards at a table, you know? So yeah, it was kind of finding those differences and moving towards them rather than like looking, you know, when you see something in a character that is something about yourself that you don't like, sometimes that's something to like amplify. Tell us about the class. Oh, hi, Eleanor.
Let me read it out for people. So Eleanor Henderson.
I don't know why I shouted that.
Asks, hi, Eleanor. Can you tell us about the class you're teaching at Wells? What was important to you in selecting the texts?
So yeah, I'm teaching a class. It's a sort of survey class in genre fiction, and you know, that's such a broad topic area, and I feel like every unit that we're doing could be a class on its own. But I really wanted to focus on contemporary authors, and by contemporary I mean like books that are from the last 5 years. I wanted to do a really diverse set of authors. I sort of wanted to move away from the canon in all of these genres. You know, you could do like, okay, we're doing fantasy, so let's read some Tolkien. We're doing detective novels, so let's read some Raymond Chandler. And there, I do think that there is a value to that. I think there's also a value in like knowing where these genres and where the industry is right now. So that was a sort of nowness was important to me, and finding something that I thought like represented a some form of deep like knowledge of or interaction with the genre as a whole. So the other thing was that all of the authors had to sort of be self-identifying as authors in that genre. So like we weren't going to do Margaret Atwood because Margaret Atwood fancies herself a literary author, which she is within her rights to do because she's Margaret Atwood. So it had to be people who were like, no, I am a sci-fi author. I'm writing detective fiction. I'm writing romance. But yeah, like trying to keep it, to keep a list that was contemporary and keep a list that was like pretty super diverse. I don't think we have any straight white dudes on the syllabus other than film directors.
Fantastic, Bob. Thanks. Could you dive us back into the world of?
Yeah, I was going to read something different if that's okay.
Please, sure.
I mean, you can't stop me.
Oh, I'm drunk with Zoom power.
No, so you could probably mute me. So I'm going to read from a book that I finished earlier this year. This is called The Floating University. It is a fantasy novel, which is new for me. And it is set in Warsaw at the end of the 19th century. So that is a thing that you need to know. And you need to know that Warsaw and most of Poland at that time was part of the Russian Empire. It was occupied by the Russians. And that's it. That's all I'm giving you for preface. So this chapter is called Through a Mouth of Brick. Perched in the Barbican's turret window like a vulture, Kazia Przyboroska watches a half dozen women fish a body out of the Vistula, which is the river. Vistula is the river that runs through the center of Warsaw. They remove their shoes before stepping into the water, heedless of the hems of their dresses. The body is mired in the shallows, but 3 women position themselves downstream in case a surge dislodges it from the reeds and sends it along the river's course. Kazia thinks of Moses found among the bulrushes and the water spirits the river teemed with before the Russians came, before Kazia was born. These stories are about life coming out of the water. This is their opposite. The face is puffy from days in the water, but Kazia knows the body belonged to a woman because it floats face up. Her father spouts medical trivia over dinner, unpalatable facts like the volume of mucus in the human head or the flexural strength of a femur. Some stick with her. More telling than the way the body floats is that the women are here to remove it. If the police pull a body from the river, a citizen put it there. A card game escalates into a knife fight. A battered wife brains her husband with a skillet, and it ends with a splash in the river. The police ask questions, make empty noises about further investigation, then dump the body in a pauper's grave in the outer provinces beyond the wall. If the body waits in the river, police blind to it, the police put it there. When this happens, women remove it. They wrap the body in a winding cloth and carry it to the morgue in the basement of the Hospital of the Child Jesus in hopes it can be identified. No one asks them to do this. If there's a body in the Vistula, the women come to claim it. Kazia takes the stairs down the turret 2 at a time, her feet slapping stone steps and drawing the attention of the building's residents. They poke their heads into the stairwell and mutter curses in Polish or shout them in Russian as she spirals down. She wasted too much time watching the removal of the corpse. Of all the teachers at the floating university, Pani Zajac is the least tolerant of late students. The decent thing would be to join the pallbearers in their procession to the morgue, but Pani Zajac makes no allowance for Catholic decency. Kazia sprints past the women, past a knot of police in their beige gray coats. The one makes a joke as the women hoist the shrouded body onto their shoulders, and they all chuckle with their distinctive Russian laughs, like cats hacking up hairballs. Kazia arrives at Child Jesus before the clock in the train terminal begins to toll 4. The hospital has a broad, plain face and feels out of place in the center of the city, the bustle of shops and flats accreted to it. On the front steps, Russian doctors smoke cigarettes and impassively watch as patients are carried in and limp out. Kazia skirts around the side of the building as the first bell peals. In the alley, Polish orderlies and nurses crack jokes about the doctors in hushed voices. They pay Kazia no notice. A collection of gray bricks gives off a soft glow, like a fire dying. She lays her palm flat against the cool brick as the second bell tolls. Rozpoczynać, she says. Her voice begins deep in her chest. The word means open, but also commence. It interacts with the working Pani Zajac placed on the bricks, which pull away from one another like teeth to produce an opening large enough for Kazia to enter without ducking. She checks the hospital employees, now passing around a flask, then enters. The third bell rings, and her working disengages from the bricks. The door scrapes shut along its arc on the dusty floor. Through the narrowing gap, Kazi hears a desperate cry. Rozpodjijek! Rozpodjijek! The word's different from when Kazi has said it. Lacking center and depth, it's a word, not a working. The fourth bell tolls, and the gap between the door and the wall is barely big enough to squeeze through, closing by the second. Kasia spits the word into the dust by the door. Pani Zajek's working pulls against Kasia's, stronger by skill, but weaker by intent. The door holds, straining Kasia's will. Maria Skłodowska, Kasia's best friend and chosen sister, sticks one leg through the gap. The brick teeth snag the hem of her black wool dress. If Kasia loses control of the working, the door will bite Maria's leg off, but Maria slips through the narrowing aperture. Once she's safe, Kasia unbinds the working, and the door seamlessly joins the wall. You're late, Kasia says, as Maria shoos brick dust from her dress. Only barely, says Maria. She kisses Kasia on both cheeks, a French affectation she's trying out. Kasia rolls her eyes, but savors the feeling of Maria's warm, dry lips on her cheek. Come on then, Maria says, and heads down the damp tunnel, Kasia lagging behind as if she were the late one. Maybe we should begin today's lesson with the subtle but discernible difference between 4 o'clock and 2 minutes past, says Pani Zajek, as Maria and Kasia enter the morgue. She has wiry gray hair on one side of her scalp. The other side is a roiling ocean of burn scars. Her face is paler than the skin of the body from the river. A glowing orange salamander the length of an index finger pokes out of her collar and orbits her neck, then peeks from the cuff of her sleeve. It's Pani Zajek's familiar, Gert. Kasia is unclear on whether familiars are named by their owners or manifest with pre-existing names that wait to be discovered. It's one of the confusing aspects of the art, intuitive rather than learned. The scarring marks Pani Zajek as a veteran of the January Rising 8 years earlier. Few women escaped without scars. She remains wanted for arrest and has barely seen the sun since the Rising. Kasia and Maria mutter deferential apologies, which Pani Zajek swats away. Take the table in the corner, Pani Zajek says. She holds out a jar of white paste that reeks of spearmint. Kasia and Maria dip in 2 fingers and swipe them under their noses. The ones who arrive last get the body that arrived first. Heads hung, they make their way through the gauntlet of the other girls, each with her own mustache of white paste. The girls are paired except for Felicia, universally unloved, and each pair stands by a shrouded body on a slab. Pani Zajek grabs Kasia's arm as she passes, and Kasia braces for another dressing down. You held the door open for her, Pani Zajek says quietly. Kasia isn't sure if it's a question or an accusation. She was a few seconds late, Kasia says. I didn't think there was any harm. It's impressive, says Pani Zajek, her face impassive. There's a knock on the door. Reflexes honed by practice, the girls cast shadow workings over themselves. With a word, each blends into the gloom of the morgue, undetectable. The door opens and the pallbearers from the river enter 2 by 2, pressing close to squeeze their burden through the door. The winding cloth drips river water. It's all right, girls, says Pani Zajek. These are good women and friends. 9 girls emerge warily from the shadows. The floating university has terms for women who are not part of it. There are cunning women who know folk remedies and hedge magics, but have no proper training. There are good women and girls who have neither training nor the spark to receive it. Good women and friends indicates artless women who provide support to the floating or have daughters enrolled. The lead pallbearer whispers to Pani Zajek, who looks stricken by what she hears. Put her over there, she says. She points to a vacant slab in the corner of the room. Should we remove the winding cloth, the woman asks. She's been in the water for days. I worry the skin. I'll tend to her after the girls have gone, says Pani Zajek. The pallbearer is about to say something else, but Pani Zajek cuts her off. I'll be very careful. The pallbearer nods, and the women lay the wrapped body on the empty slab behind Kasia and Maria. Kasia glances over her shoulder as if the body might be one of the Russian inspectors who audited their classes at the girls' school to be sure only Russian was spoken. The pallbearers leave the room single file. Maria removes the sheet from their cadaver, an old woman, mouth void of teeth and skin leathery. Kasia, says Pani Zajek, summoning the class's attention back. What can you tell me about her? Nothing, says Kasia. I didn't know her. Pani Zajek smiles, and the orange salamander scurries up the back of her neck to perch on the bald side of her head. It's a good answer, she says. Maybe even the correct answer. You didn't know her in life and you won't know her now, but listen to her and tell me what she tells you. Kazuya looks at the body again. The art is about language, but also about binding. At the heart of any binding is a sympathetic connection. She wouldn't risk binding herself to dead flesh. There are nightmare stories about what comes of necromantic binds, but there may be a connection less than a full binding. Kazuya thinks about Pani Zajek's words and listens to the body on the slab in front of her. She places her hand on the woman's forehead. The flesh is cool and smooth as marble. She lived in the sun, Kazuya says. She was a farm worker from the provinces outside the wall. She skimmed and gleaned when she could, enough to bring to market. All this is deduction, like a detective in a story. What comes next is a truth whispered from inside the body. She shouldn't have been here, Kazuya said. She wasn't well, but her husband was worse. If she had a good day at market, she could pay a doctor to come see him. She was in the city to find my father, Kazuya thinks, to bring him back with her. No one bought anything. She was too tired to go home. She sat down in the Saxon garden under a tree. She was taking a little rest. Pani Zajek takes Kazuya's wrist and pulls her hand from the woman's forehead. The whispers stop. Very good, Kazuya, she says. She turns to the rest of the class. I invite you to touch them, she says. They don't mind. The dead are generous. Other girls draw back at the suggestion, but Maria has been waiting for permission. She pokes at the hollow under the woman's shoulder blade. She prods the fat of her stomach. Try the joints, Pani Zajek says. Bend an elbow, flex a knee. This is an order, and the girls lay hands on the bodies as if they might be red hot. Kazuya holds the old woman's face in her right hand. She puts her thumb and forefingers at the points of the jaw and moves it as much as she can. It resists more strongly than Pani Zajek's working on the brick door. The mortician is sympathetic to our cause, Pani Zajek says. This is how the teachers describe men who give material aid to the floating university, money, books, space, to indicate begrudging thanks. He has provided us with bodies whose expiries fall within a particular window. At the moment of death, the body and the force that animates it come to rest. Hours after death, the animating force wakes and attempts to enliven the expired tissue. This is the third stage of death. Who can tell me? Before she can finish the question, Maria's hand is in the air. When they were young, Maria would jump out of her seat if she knew an answer. The other girls don't look kindly on her enthusiasm. Kazuya has worked with Maria to temper it, but the training's never properly taken. Yes, Maria, says Pani Zajek. Petronella whispers something to her partner, who snickers. Once she's offered to answer, Maria remembers herself and pauses as if struggling to recall. Pallor mortis, she says, counting the stages off with her fingers, the paleness after death. Algor mortis, the cooling of the body. She fakes another pause before extending her third finger. Rigor mortis, as you said, and lever mortis, the settling of blood. Very good, Pan Skledoska, says Pani Zajek. Very good, Pan Skledoska, whispers Petronella mockingly. It's the third stage that concerns us, the only one which is temporary. Soon the body will surrender to rot, and the animating spirit will find no hold in the flesh. And there the soul will wait for the day that Christ calls it forth to judgment, Felicia announces. She nods, having pronounced an absolute truth. Pani Zajek presses her lips together. Yes, well, she says. Since the date of judgment is uncertain and no one likes to be kept waiting, there is a working to release the soul from the body, only effective during this window. It's the oldest working in the art. In a way, it's foundational to all others. Through words and gesture and intent, we bind a piece of ourselves to the physical world to work our will. A binding may be the trickle of a drought-starved creek, the babble of a river, or the roar of a wave about to crash on the shore, but it is the conduit between radiant spirit and dull matter. This working undoes the most fundamental binding, the tether between body and spirit. This working is the birthright of all Polish women. Now we teach it underground, like a shameful secret. Better that than it be forgotten. All the girls lean forward, as they do each time a lesson winnows to the point where knowledge is to be imparted. Pani Zajek speaks a word barely audible. She nods, giving them permission to attempt the working. Kazuya looks to Maria, who outshines them all in book learning, but stumbles when it comes to application of the art. You do it, Maria says. You should try, Kazuya says. Maria shakes her head. Not this, she says. Kazuya nods and lays her hand over the old woman's eyes. She speaks the word and feels a change in the body. There's no fluttering of soul escaping or gust of ascending ghost. Tension releases. The arms and legs come to rest against the slab. The jaw slackens. Kazuya can't say something is left, but something is gone. Remember this, says Pane Zejek. Hope when the time comes, someone near you remembers it. This is the only way that we will live, that we will leave Warsaw. That's it.
That's wonderful, Bob. Thank you. Looking looking at the time, I think we should pivot to our official Q&A time, right? And I will remind folks that they can write in the chat, as I see we already have a couple that I will read out, and you can also raise your hand in Zoom, and I will call on you, and you can ask your question directly. But while I'm navigating this and getting it ready, I'll put in the link one more time. I'll put in the chat one more time the link to Buffalo Street Books there, so you can go out and pick up one of Bob's books if you like. So one of the questions that came in while you were talking came from Courtney Cloutier, who said, I don't want to push a genre onto the Floating University, but when writing historical fantasy, how tied to historical accuracy did you feel? When did you feel like it was okay to take some liberties, and when did you refuse to bend the truth?
So this book actually started as a straight historical novel without witches and stuff, and something about it wasn't quite working, and it was really, I sort of put it in a drawer for a couple years, and went back to it last year. So it was exceedingly accurate. In its earlier forms, it was very, very true to history as much as I could make it so. There were difficulties in that I don't speak or read Polish, as you might have picked up by my attempt to say one word in Polish. But beyond like Dzień dobry, I don't really speak it. So I anything that wasn't translated in English, I didn't have access to. It was also, there were aspects in the original book that went into the Jewish district in Warsaw, what we think of as the Warsaw Ghetto. And at the time that I was writing about, which would have been 1889, that was a Hasidic community, and most of those records are gone. Like, it was actually a really terrifying thing to run into in research, where there was nothing. And that I kind of pursued as much as I could, but like even finding a map of that neighborhood before the 1930s was next to impossible. And yeah, in that, so the spoiler, Maria from this is Mary Curie, who grew up in Warsaw until she was, this is sort of part of the story here, is her leaving for Paris. And so there was a whole section in the original, and it almost made it into this draft, that was her sort of later in life, and it was like hour by hour researched, of a trip with her family to London to the Royal Society. And I had to sort of work in the fictional parts within like an itinerary that I had, that I was able to find for her. So yeah, and then this time I went a little more fast and loose. I was still like using the same maps, and you're using like currency charts and commodity pricings, and like yeah, there's a lot, and I tried to be as true as possible. Like, I didn't, you don't want like somebody to just like turn on a radio or something. So there's nothing in there that is actively anachronistic.
Awesome. Thank you. And there's a related question maybe from Briar May, who asks, how much research did you do specifically on historical witchcraft for this book, or was it primarily a fantasy invention?
Lots. And on different traditions of witchcraft. I sort of, the system that the girls are teaching and using in the novel is my own creation, but it's based on Polish folk tradition. As the novel sort of expands, you see that there's a separate kind of magic that that Russians are using, and this is based on like more of a sort of like object-based or like fetish-based magic that was sort of practiced by Russian peasantry. And I kind of expanded that into the idea of like a church that was sort of controlling that. So it was combining ideas of like Eastern Orthodox Church and this sort of peasant magical tradition that continued to operate during Imperial Russia. But yeah, it was a lot of research and then making things up and making up like, okay, well, this is based on British history, this is what magic in Britain is going to look like. And it was a mix of like actual British history and literary magic within Britain. And then coming up with a system that's sort of for the girls in Poland, it's very much language based, and it's because the language was suppressed during the time. Like you could be arrested for speaking Polish in public, and this idea of the floating university was an actual thing. It was illegal to educate women past what we would think of now as like middle school age or middle school level, and Poland has a really long a long-standing academic culture for women, and they were eliminated from university posts. They were completely disenfranchised, and so groups of women were teaching teaching girls to get them ready to go to university elsewhere. This went on for probably about like 5 or 6 years, particularly in Warsaw, and Maria Skłodowska was one of the students.
Oh, that's wild. And as a frequent patron of your trivia nights, I know that Marie Curie has appeared a couple of times as an answer. What was the impetus for telling this story for you?
Well, I grew up in a very Polish community in Cheektowaga, outside of Buffalo. So like most of a lot of my friends growing up were Polish or of Polish descent. And I was reading, I feel like I should be able to just like grab all my research books off the shelf, but it's been long enough that I put most of them away. I was reading a book called Radioactive by Lauren Redness. That's a biography of Curie, like a graphic biography. And she mentions this concept of the floating university. I had never heard of it before. And I was like, that is wild that there is not just a ton written about this. And I started getting into it, and I started researching like the state of Poland, sort of the Polish situation, the history of Poland. And it's fascinating and sad, and sort of informs the culture in a really interesting way, in good and bad ways. You know, in the sort of return to far right Catholicism and nationalism that you're seeing in Poland now, but also in a sort of like a very dark and particular sense of humor that is sort of what I grew up with. And then I was, you know, you look at the history and like, oh, that's why you guys are, that's why you think that's funny. So yeah, it grew out of just finding this one little bit of thing in this little sort of open path in a book that I was reading, and falling completely down a rabbit hole with it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We have another from Courtney who asks, how much research do you have to do before you feel comfortable starting your first draft? I guess that relationship between research and composition there.
Yeah, it varies a lot. And they can go, you know, sort of in tandem. I think you do research until you feel like you're ready to go, and then you just keep doing it as you're going. You know, I probably read more nonfiction than I do fiction at any given time, because I'm reading like 3 different things that might inform what I'm working on. And, you know, most of that doesn't make it onto the page, because frankly, nobody wants to read the amount of stuff that I now know about like late 19th century Warsaw. And my agent has made it clear to me that nobody wants to read the like deep dives on like the history of partitions. But yeah, you read until something sort of moves you forward, and then you go back to the research. You keep the research up, and you keep incorporating it. And you know, it's something you go back to when you stall out, and reading widely and reading stuff that is like not, that is maybe just adjacent to what you're working on. For the Nobody People and the Somebody People, I started out reading a lot of sort of Black Lives Matter and history of movements and anti-racist stuff, and it wasn't quite what I was looking for. And then I started reading into disability rights and history of disability rights, and again, I'm like looking for my research books that are definitely put away because I finished that book like quite a while ago. But the thing that sort of made everything come together, and I was already well into the book, was reading Deaf President Now, which is about the history of Gallaudet University, or not the history, but this moment at Gallaudet, which is the country's oldest college for deaf students. And the board of trustees was replacing the president, and the students were like, no, the president has to be someone who's deaf. And it is sort of the beginning of, when we hear the sentiment, nothing about us without us, it's sort of grounded in this moment at Gallaudet. And so that story was like, okay, I know exactly what this school that I'm making up looks like now, and what this moment for them is like, because the first book particularly is about this coming out and going public moment. And this was something that came along late in the research, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is exactly what I needed.
Fascinating. I wonder if that relationship to sort of like a recursive genesis to the process could dovetail with Naomi's next question, which is just looking back at the Floating University, what inspired you to add witchcraft to Marie Curie's story?
I was at her crypt. we were in I'd finished this book. I'd really struggled with this book. I'd probably put in like 2 years on it, and it something was not working, and we had taken it to my editor, and she passed on it, and my agent was like, you need to move away from this. So I had put it in a drawer, and we were in Paris, and we were in a crypt, and my wife is like, do you know where we are right now? And I was like, holy shit. And we were in Mary Curie's crypt, and it just sort of brought everything right back to the front of my brain. And so we were actually on the Channel train coming back, and I leaned over to my wife, who by that point had to be really tired of hearing about this book, especially because she's a historian. So anytime that I like stopped on the research and I'm like, I'm just going to make something up, she's like, you're not allowed to do that. I leaned over and I was like, hey, what if instead of just a school for girls, it was a school for witches? And I like sat on that idea for probably like 2 years before I actually got down to, and it was still something that I was just going to try out while I just finished all the edits on the Nobody People, and I'd sent in the draft of the Somebody People, so I was waiting. So I'm like, I need something to do that is not going to be all encompassing, but let me see if I could. And the idea at first was just to sort of add it in. I was like, oh, I should be really easy to just drop this right in. And it did end up like completely restructuring the story and changing the characters, which is as you would hope. But yeah, that's how it started. I was in Mary Curie's crypt.
That is a fascinating and maybe appropriately dark place to. Oh no, never mind. All right, one quick one from Greg here. Have you ever struggled with your research distracting you from your writing? And if so, how did you pivot back to actually writing?
Yeah, at some point you sort of like pull yourself out of it. Yeah, it's easy to fall into it entirely, and like you're not writing a thesis. So at some point, a lot of times I will just go back to drafting and start bracketing things. Like a lot of it comes down to being willing to make mistakes in a first draft and then like return to research to flesh that out. Because sometimes research will completely change the direction of a work, and sometimes it is just like, okay, I don't need to know what street they're walking down right now. Um, so yeah, you just, I think at some point, sometimes it's like, oh, I know I'm having too much fun doing the research. But very often you just, you know that you're procrastinating, like some Rubicon has been crossed and you're no longer being productive. You're just like reading weird, like following weird side paths that aren't gonna feed back in.
That's great. For several of these process questions, I found myself thinking about my students who are working on midterms right now and how not dissimilar creative and critical writing can be in these ways.
Yeah.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, Bob. I'm going to actually um, um, pivot over. I think I unspotlighted you, so maybe I am visible now here for the closing remarks, which is just to say, thank you all so much. Thank you, Bob, again, for this wonderful reading and conversation. We have a few events coming up incredibly quickly, so keep your eyes open wherever you saw this advertised, because on October 15th, we have Meredith Toulousan joining the series with their new memoir. And on October 19th, right after that, we have the poets Joshua Harmon and Andrew Zawacki reading from their new collections of poetry as well. So you'll see invitations to these events shortly. And please do share them with your broader communities. If we're going to be doing these things virtually, then I want to take advantage of the opportunities that that affords us. And so I'm really pleased to have seen so many people here tonight who couldn't have made it to the Wells campus had we been doing this in person. And I hope we can keep including more and more people in these wonderful events. So thank you again, everyone, for coming and your great questions. And thank you, Bob, for a fantastic event. Good night, everyone.